Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to my first Better Managers Briefing of 2021. I'd like to thank Matt Roberts for filling in for me these past couple of weeks. And as you know, each day at this time, we bring you views on management topics that matter. Now, today, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our past president, Bruce Carnegie-Brown. Bruce is a CMI companion. He's also the vice chair of Banco Santander and the chair of Lloyd's of London. And a great pleasure to have him here today. Welcome, Bruce.
Hi, it's a great pleasure to be here.
So clearly, some of the sectors that you're involved in, namely Lloyd's of London and of course the financial sector, in these large global organizations have been experiencing COVID, in their own particular ways. How much do you think businesses will change permanently in COVID, and how much do you think they will snap back?
So I think that's uncertain. There's an uncertainty to that, to the answer around that at the moment, and I think we've got to work harder on mapping what we think the future looks like, because actually underneath all of this disruption created by the pandemic, there are some positives associated with not having to commute to work every day. And I'm a little bit worried that the longer the pandemic goes on, the more people will redefine normality as everyone going back to work. And I think we want to try to capture the best of what we've had in the pandemic, as well as getting past the worst of it. And I think muscle memory runs deep, frankly. And I think these kind of exchanges are relatively easy to do because everybody is remote, and I think it's also relatively easy when everyone's physical. But I think this mapping of the physical and the remote, which I think should be part of our future work environment, is going to be much tougher to manage, because the people physically present tend to dominate conversations, and the people who are present on the wall by video are going to struggle. And I think there'll also be coercive behavior, some of it covert, some of it overt, both in terms of trying to persuade people to come back to work, but even customers. If you want to pitch for a piece of business with your customer and you say, well, I'll get on a video conference and we'll pitch to you. If the customer comes back and says, well, your competitor is coming around to visit me, are you going to be jumping on that plane and going straight out there? And so will the new ways of working get undermined by historic practices and tests of loyalty and commitment? And I think we've got to articulate that future, because otherwise I think it's going to be very confusing for everybody. Is it acceptable not to get on that plane because I can do an effective job of pitching by video conference? And I don't think we know what that future looks like yet, but I'm spending quite a lot of time worrying about that, because I'm in the fortunate position that the businesses I work with have been easy to convert to remote working, and we've been able to spend time in common with other employers thinking about the well-being of our employees, providing them with the right equipment to work remotely. But it also creates an inequality, doesn't it? Because there are an awful lot of people who have to work in the physical environment, and we've seen the devastation of the airline sector, the hospitality sector, the high street retail sector. And so there's an inequality in terms of ability to respond to this crisis.
Yeah, those are all excellent points. And, you've touched on some of the things that you found good. So the not having to commute, and maybe, the enforced digital transformation of many businesses that might bring lasting good. Are there other things that you think are good that have come out of the management and leadership trends you've seen, and those, that you think are less good that you'd like to share with us?
Well, there's just no bumping into people anymore, whether it's in the office environment or frankly in the street outside. And so I think you have to be much more structured about your engagement. And I've found for myself, I've had to work harder at that. And so rather than the osmosis of people coming and finding you, you've got to reach out more, would be the first point. The second point would be that I think it gets very transactional in these kinds of interactions. So again, the small talk gets pushed aside quite quickly and we get on with the business of the meeting. And the meetings are quite efficient, but we're losing some of that spontaneity, some of the softer parts of our connection with people. On the more positive side, I found an ability to connect. So employee engagement, I think, has gone up in many cases. When we host employee engagement sessions at Lloyd's, the attendance is much higher and we get full attendance from people not just in the UK, but also in our offices internationally. And that didn't happen before when we were doing these things physically. And we've increased the rate of that engagement. So that's a positive. I've actually found it quite interesting to join a series of talks, a bit like this one, so I can listen and learn from other people. I wasn't really doing that when I was at work because my day got kind of invaded by everybody else. And now today, with the extra time you have through not commuting, the ability to join in webinars and learn and understand and share experiences with other people, I think has been actually quite a big positive. But there's a bit of a negative in all of that, that it all begins to blur what's work and what's home life. When is the webinar fun versus when is the webinar for kind of professional and business reasons? And I find some of that quite difficult to work with.
Yeah, no, there's just some great points in there. And, you're right. I'm sure the people at Lloyd's are seeing a lot more of you in your weekly briefings than they saw, in the real world. And so that visibility and that communication is very important, as is the time for learning that you've mentioned. So that kind of segues into, what have you personally learned as a leader? What are some of the changes that you think you'll be carrying with you into the future? And what are some of the challenges that you'll be looking forward to overcoming?
Well, so first of all, you mentioned visibility, and that is probably true, but I think there's a distinction between visibility and connectivity. So you and I are talking now, but we can't see our audience, so we have no ability to kind of gauge their receptivity to what we're talking about. And that human interaction is quite an important part, I think, of relationships and appreciation for whether we're kind of on topic. Against that, actually, I found people are much more willing to ask questions in this format than often they were when everybody was in the room, and so that level of engagement has been higher. Equally, this format points out some behavioral characteristics. So when we were all in the room together, there was always the individual at the table, usually a man, talking across people and not letting everyone participate. When that happens in this kind of environment, it becomes very, very obvious. And so some of that etiquette and behaviors need to be corrected really quite quickly in this kind of environment. It's the same issue with people asking questions, the ones that don't bother to put up the electronic hand or wave to say they've got a question, but just start talking and monopolize the conversation. These kinds of behaviors become very obvious in the digital world, and I think are much less easy to tolerate, which is probably a good thing. Maybe we're getting on top of them. I've certainly found it easier to listen more, and typically I get invited a bit like today to do most of the talking, and actually it's really good for everybody to be listening and learning. And as I say, by participating in other webinars around issues not necessarily just of management, but around the professional thing I'm connected with, I think there's been a real opportunity to engage, and actually transatlantically as well. There's less formality, but also I regret the disappearance of the telephone call. Everything has somehow become a Zoom call. What happened to the good old telephone call? And the nice thing about a telephone call is you can actually stand up and walk around when you're taking a telephone call, whereas this is a very sedentary way of engaging.
Absolutely. Well, at CMI, we have a walk and talk hour every day. I think actually we stole that idea from Lloyd's. I think you planted it in our head. You said that you had these 2-hour breaks in the middle of the day when it was still light, where you said to people, go out, have a phone call, don't sit on the Zoom. And I think that's a really good thing. I think your observations too about the digital world curbing some of those, more dominant behaviors, such as the talking across of people, or encouraging more introverted people to ask questions in chat anonymously. Those are actually things that are making work that much more inclusive. And I think that's great. And I think it's also, like you said, listening more. We found in our Management Transform survey that listening is just such an important management skill, and maybe we're all listening that little bit more. But of course, for many people and groups, there's some really big longer term implications for this pandemic. So, for example, young people, as well as women and ethnic minorities. What do you think the implications are for them? Maybe starting with young people.
Well, I think they will struggle more than most others, even in a services environment, to develop their skills, because we learn an enormous amount from the people we work with, and particularly the more experienced people. It's how we learn our way into the business. And there's an absence of that. And so, again, I think young people need to be more demanding, but employers need to be more providing of tools to replace and supplement that. So, one of the other things that happened at Lloyd's was a lot of our teaching sessions disappear. We bring in brokers and underwriters to talk about and teach on certain aspects of the business, and that was all physical, and actually people enjoyed a lot of international visitors coming to London, coming to the Lloyd's building, and that was a big part of our kind of education and outreach programs. That, of course, got shut down right at the beginning in lockdown one, and we've had to try to move those online, and CMI's had some of the same experience, of course, very successfully in terms of moving things online. So moving education online, but it's also, the second part of it is networks. Networks get built in softer ways than just interactions, and of course younger people typically don't have those networks as they come into the workplace, and older people like me have developed networks that we can rely on, and even if we don't see people for a while, there's a built-in relationship and trust that young people still need to develop. And so more experienced people, I think, need to be encouraging younger people in conversations, because again, if you were sitting at a desk, it's easy to pull the junior guy over and say, come and join this conversation. On Zoom or Teams or whatever, you've got to be much more organized about getting people in there. And then there's a little bit of a sense of kind of what's he doing on, or she doing on this video. And so it's not quite as informal as just kind of all mucking around a conference call, for instance. So, but I think it's very necessary, and young people absolutely need that, and particularly, of course, because I think underlying your question, their remote environments typically are much more constrained than people who live in bigger houses and have rooms that they can move to that are protected from the home environment, if you like. And then, of course, people with homeschooling, all of those challenges as well. It's an extraordinarily difficult time, and so how you create that continued relationship and develop that relationship between younger people with their more experienced partners, but also build on the culture of an organization, right? Because that is also under challenge, I think, over time. And those of us who've got kind of equity in that are happy using that equity up, but we've got to refill the equity of the culture of the places that we work in. And I think that's one of the potentially longer term consequences of the pandemic.
Yeah, no, it's true. And not to mention the mass unemployment that many young people are, finding themselves confronting, and at a very vital time in their career where they should be making those connections and getting that development opportunity, the in-person development opportunity. And of course, that's not happening. So they are struggling, and our research shows the younger generation is really struggling and missing that interaction. Another group that is struggling are women. Many women, as you mentioned, homeschooling. The burden still falls disproportionately on women to carry out that homeschooling and caring, and so many people are very worried that this will set back gender equality and gender balance by a significant amount. What's your view, and how can that be mitigated?
Well, I have to be careful as a male in this conversation as to whether my experience and my observations have any relevance. But I would say, actually, I think long term there's potentially some real advantage to women in what's happened here, because what we also knew from history is that women had to take time out of the workplace to do the childbearing and the child rearing, and this disadvantaged them in terms of their re-access to the workplace and the level of seniority they came back in on, and of course it creates the whole gender pay gap challenge that we all face. Whereas I think now there's a much greater understanding that you can work from home, you can work remotely, you can work irregular hours around things like schooling and child minding, and so medium term, I'm reasonably optimistic that this actually helps level things up. I think also the husbands are at home more today than they ever were, and they see exactly how much hard work there is, and hopefully most of us are doing more of the sharing. I mean, I'm a happy place where my children have flown the nest, so I don't have to kind of reconstruct myself
But I
to
believe
quite the
you
same
were
extent.
cooking. Yeah, I believe
Well,
you
I
were
am cooking, yes,
yes,
and
for
I
your
find that
family.
quite enjoyable.
Yeah, I know, that's fine. It's also a way of coming together when you can't see anybody else, getting together with your partner, thinking about what you're going to cook, and then kind of enjoying the output of that. No, you've got to find those points of interaction. We can't go to the theatre anymore. We can't go and watch football matches. There's a constraint, and so we have to find other ways to keep ourselves active, bring different experiences into our relationships. So I'm actually, I mean, while I can see the short-term difficulties that you articulate for women, I'm actually reasonably hopeful that it actually accelerates the role of women and indeed other people who are disadvantaged by not always being able to be physically present in the workplace in terms of their career opportunities.
Well, certainly fathers are participating more in house caring and household chores and childcare now than they were pre-pandemic, although it is still women doing most of the work. And, we do need to be very careful as employers how we bring people back into work. And as you say, hopefully keep that flexible working ethos that we've all mastered during this pandemic front and center. So obviously, CMI, we do a lot to support. And by the way, we are going to take questions. If you have a question you'd like to ask Bruce, please just put it in the chat and we will get to as many questions as we can. But first, I just wanted to talk a little bit about CMI. Obviously, we are trying to do things to support managers and leaders. What do you think that we should be doing? And actually, what do you think employers should be doing more generally as we come out of this pandemic to really help people get on?
Well, so I think there are short-term issues that I think the better employers are all trying to push on. So well-being exercises for employees, both consciousness of where employees are struggling and making sure that that's kind of an open issue to be shared, not something to be hidden. Actually putting in education programs and training programs for senior managers and in fact middle managers in terms of how to manage through that issue. And the whole issue of management, how do you manage your teams when you're all remote? And I think people have ways of doing that. I mean, at Lloyd's, we also do kind of yoga classes online. And, I'm not sure, I mean, I don't participate in them, so maybe I'm bringing a prejudice. I'm not sure I necessarily feel I want to do yoga with the people I work with. I might want to do yoga with other people online. But it's, making those facilities there, it's also part of the networking issue and some softer kind of interactions that we badly need. More medium term, it comes back to where we started this conversation, which is employers creating the right environment where remote working can sit alongside physical working, that I think is going to be really important. And not just some people remote and some people physical, but of course just through the working week. Who's in and who's out might vary from day to day, and we've got to be a little bit careful we don't default to everybody being in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Monday and Friday suddenly becomes the remote day. I mean, that might expose what remote working is and feed the prejudice of people who always felt that remote working meant having their day off. And actually, if you think about the efficiencies that we're looking for in the use of buildings, it can't work if everyone's going to be in on a Wednesday. You've got to have the same capacity you have today. So we have to spread ourselves across the working week. And frankly, arguably, from a productivity point of view, even think about not any one person working more days than they do currently, in fact, potentially fewer, but working across maybe a 6 or 7 day week rather than a 5 day week. where you think of Saturdays and Sundays alongside the rest of the week, and think about how you balance and navigate resources that way if we're really looking at a kind of productivity and efficiency and people's wish to work in different styles and in different ways. So I think there's quite a lot of scope here. But I think the problem is the default is back to where we were before, and the evidence of success is back to the way we were before, unless we put out a kind of new future for people to work towards. And the longer the pandemic goes on, again, the problem here is most people are sitting here thinking, I've just got to get through this and then we can get back to normality. And the truth is it's taking longer. And I think it's going to be even longer than most people think. And even if the vaccine works, I think the pandemic is going to turn into some flu-like virus that recurs. We've seen that it's incredibly smart in terms of its ability to mutate. And so, let's not jump to assumptions that this is disappearing, even if it's June rather than April. And if we've got to think about adapting our ways of working on a permanent basis, not just for an interim period. And that struggle is much harder than the hiatus we had in lockdown 1, where it was kind of fun to be at home. The spring was fantastic. The weather was good. You had more time because you weren't commuting. It was a new experience. Everyone was in the same position. Now here we are 12 months on, and it's still going on. And I think some of the issues that you identify in terms of pressures on people, the things that were kind of tolerable at the beginning, working from your bedroom or not having a proper setup at home, are now not tolerable because it's part of your everyday life. And we've got, I think, to adapt to more of this on a permanent basis.
Yeah, people are feeling pretty grim. And struggling with mental health. So what's your top tip for our listeners before we take the questions as to what they can do to support their own well-being?
Well, I'm pretty consistent on this, whether it's physical or remote. I think you've got to manage your own life, take ownership of it if you can. There are obviously some people who struggle with that, but to the extent that you can, I think ask questions, be demanding, not in an aggressive way, but make requests of your firm and of your boss. Because on the whole, most employers, it's not all employers. We've seen some pretty bad examples. I think I was sharing one with you the other day of some boss that was making an individual come in to wash his car every day, because clearly that can't be done remotely. But who needs their car washed in the middle of a pandemic? And so there are clearly some bad behaviors out there. But for the most part, I think employers are trying to do the right things by their employees. And so if that's not connecting with you, I think you need to push more of yourself into that picture and say, no, this is what I need, and can you help me with that? And employers are trying to provide people with the right kind of equipment, desks, chairs, laptops, so they can work from home. People are trying to respect the issues of different working environments, if you've got childminding to do in the middle of the day or whatever it happens to be. But I think we've got to keep working on our own skills, so make ourselves relevant. It's tough to think about how you get a promotion in the middle of a pandemic. How do you prove that you're ready for the next step when everybody is kind of locked down in the same way? Differentiation becomes harder to do, but working on our skills, creating our networks and nurturing them and building them. This is a soft comment, not really a personal comment, but I had 3 conversations this week with people who were friends of my parents. My parents died when they were quite young, so some of their friends we've connected with through Christmas cards over a number of years, but not really spoken to. And this week, I've had 2 conversations with 2 90-year-olds and one with a 102-year-old that I hadn't spoken to for over 20 years. And so you can be organized, and hopefully that's positive for them. It's certainly positive for me, but you've got to be structured, and you've got to be willing to kind of reach out and do things you haven't done before. So the core of this is kind of creating your own priorities, seeing how the tools and skills that you've got are supported by these priorities, and then ask for the help you need in order to build on your skills and experience.
It's a great point, asking for the help you need. And now we've got some questions to ask you. Our first is from Rachel. She says, do you think a lot of the trends we're seeing might risk widening the gap between rich and poor in our society? A lot of tech or finance companies may find it easy to remain mostly remote, but in industries like manufacturing or retail, it's not as straightforward to shift everything to working remotely.
So completely agree. And I think there is now this inequality between people who are able to work remotely, substantially people in the services industry, and the recruitment for those industries is typically at the higher end of the educational spectrum, and then people in the physical workspaces being much more disadvantaged. And then frankly, even the ones that are going to work, so you think of house builders who are actually going to work as we speak, they're of course putting themselves more at risk than people who are able to work remotely. So even if you are able to work in a physical environment, it's not as safe as working remotely. So this inequality is definitely growing, and I think you observe that every day. And of course, particularly bad for those who can't work at all. Hospitality, leisure, which we talked about before, being very obvious examples, and whole businesses. Many of those are self-employed people. They own their own pub, or they certainly, their pub is their livelihood. It's been closed now for the best part of 12 months, and they have no revenue. They're losing their customer base. The franchise that they had is dissolving really over time, and so I think there's huge inequality developing here that we have to be really mindful of.
It can be very tough. And Melissa's asking, what type of support do you anticipate workforces will need from management in order to adapt back to working life, especially for those that may have been on furlough for 10 plus months?
Well, indeed, women would be able to tell you about this, because furlough is not so much different from maternity leave that women have been kind of having to have for a lot longer than men, for instance. And when you've looked at the re-entry of women into the workplace, it's been a real challenge over the years. So we can well imagine that coming back from furlough for men or women is going to be quite similar in terms of some of those challenges. I think a big part of this is how companies stay connected with their fellow staff even through the pandemic. So people don't get as disconnected as often women on maternity leave did from their places of employment. And I think that would help enormously. I think the fact that we're all learning different ways of working is helpful. So there is that makes the world a bit more equal, because the old guys are having to learn with the young guys and girls how to do these things in a different way. And the experience of a 25-year-old going through pandemic is not different from the experience of a 60-year-old going through pandemic, in terms of this not being something that is in any of our experience. So I think staying connected is the key bit, both ways, for employers with their employees and the other way around, to try to make the return to work easier for people. But it's going to be a challenge, and I think we'll have to be gentle, just as we've learned to be with mums on the way back into work, that you don't suddenly put them straight back in 5 days a week. You allow them a kind of glide path back into the world of work. I think we need to be thinking about that kind of issue for people post furlough.
Yeah, that's a good point. And actually also, as you say, now many companies are having paternity leave as well. So it'll be dads and moms returning to work and returning from furlough. Question from Colin. I'm concerned that the portrayal of lost generation and missing school creates for young people's mental health. What should employers do to shift the tipping point communications to positivity? So young people's mental health, how do we make them more positive?
Well, I think in many ways that's beyond the remit of employers, in the sense that we take in adults and we have all the management challenges for them thereafter. I think it's quite a challenge to be asking certainly employers to be reaching more into the school period. But if you're speaking as a parent, I think what we've got to do is kind of nurture young people in different ways. So I had a time when I took my young family, we went to live in Japan for a few years. And actually the school they went into was not particularly academic, and with my overly aggressive, driven nature, I would challenge the headmaster on this. And his view was, look, you've come to Japan not just for an academic experience, but for a cultural experience. And so, make sure that the time we're giving you back, you're investing in your children getting to understand Japan, because that is going to be a differentiating experience for them relative to everybody who's just grown up in the UK, for instance. And I think we need to take some of the positives out of that through the lack of schooling is what are we doing at home to try to compensate for that, not necessarily academically, but in terms of other experiences. Have we been out to look at the trees and to get people to understand the difference between an oak tree and a beech tree? Have we tried to understand some of those things that were kind of intuitive to our great-grandparents, but in our more urban environment, we've kind of completely lost the ability to engage with and to consider. And the seasons, we're used to having an avocado in our fridge any time of the year. What have we learned about those kinds of cycles, and what might we learn because we have more time together as a family to look at those things? Now, those are reasonably superficial examples, but I do think there's a way to be supporting young people that isn't purely about can they pass the next math test or how are they doing at French.
Absolutely. And, you mentioned your own hobby of cooking, you're cooking for your family. And I've read some wonderful blogs about fathers now cooking with their children, making sure that their sons learn how to cook, for example, as again, something that can be an enriching and rewarding experience when everybody's trapped at home. So we've got, maybe this is our last question now from Michael. It's a good one to end on. With many teams working from home, what would your top 3 tips be for managers to help them stay on top of team well-being throughout the pandemic? So what 3 things can they do?
Well, I think it is a little bit what we've talked about. Number one, it would be regular outreach. So, you will only know whether people are struggling if you're connecting with them. So you've got to have regular points of connection. That's one-to-one. Clearly through Zoom rather than one-to-one in face, but also potentially with teams. I think encouraging teammates to support each other as well through this period. So number one is this connection piece. I think the second piece is where we've also got to in terms of providing access to training. And it doesn't necessarily have to be provided by the employer, and it ought to be, frankly, selected by the employee in terms of what his or her skill set requirements are. But there's a plethora, including, of course, skills provided by and tools provided by CMI. There's a plethora of opportunity for people to go out and learn something new, do something different, so they feel positive about themselves in terms of developing skills. And I think that would be number 2. And, when you think lockdown is for a short period, you don't really invest in something that might be for your long-term benefit. Now that we know lockdown is for a long time, we ought to be planning that this is going to be a series of months. What can I achieve over that period? So investing in something, and frankly, it could be a hobby, it could be cooking, but it might also be something much more professionally related. And then I suppose the third thing is really just trying to stay positive through this, that actually, we will get through it. There are some good things that will come out of this, actually. And I think there's potentially a really positive future for us if we seize the opportunity. It's not going to be easy because we built up huge amounts of debt going into this as an economy, often some of us personally in terms of our ability to survive through this. So there's going to be quite a lot of stress for some time to come. But I think there is an opportunity that comes out of it. And so if you can retain a positive mindset through this, I think you have a much better chance of springing forward when we get to those sunlit uplands than if you put yourself into a negative and confined space.
So that is an absolutely great piece of advice to end on. And I'm just going to close today with a great saying I heard earlier at another meeting I was on. So Bruce is one of his top tips: stay positive, but test negative. So thank you so much, Bruce. If you've enjoyed today's broadcast, consider joining us by clicking on the link in the chat. And do join me next week when I'll welcome Paul Geddes, the CEO of QA, and Tim Stewart, the Vice Chancellor and Deputy CEO of BPP Education and Vice Chancellor of BPP University, talking about the changes in their sector and, again, what will stay and what will revert back and how they're coping. Thanks again, Bruce, and thanks everybody for joining us. Take care.